He visited his wife's grave daily until a child walked up to him. He brought fresh flowers every single morning, even though there was no one alive to receive them. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe if you love meaningful stories, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. I really enjoy seeing where these stories travel. Thomas Parker was a man of habit. Ever since his wife passed away 3 years ago, he hadn't missed a single morning visit to her grave. Rain, snow, blistering heat, it didn't matter. At exactly 9 a.m., Thomas would pull up in his old Chevy pickup, step out slowly, always in his pressed shirt and flat cap, and walk the same path through Rosewood Cemetery to Section C, Row 5, Plot 22. Margaret Parker, beloved wife, 1948-2022. Each visit was quiet, deliberate. He brought fresh daisies, her favorite, and trimmed the grass around the stone with small clippers he kept in his coat pocket. After arranging the flowers just so, Thomas would sit down on the wooden bench nearby and talk. "How's the morning over there, Margie?" he'd say, smiling at the headstone like it could smile back. "It's a little humid today. I wore the light coat like you always told me to. You were right again." To anyone watching, it might have looked like he was talking to himself. But Thomas never felt that way. To him, Margaret was listening. Always had been. People at the cemetery came and went, families mourning, gardeners trimming, joggers passing through, but Thomas never stayed for anyone else. His time was sacred. The few workers who saw him every day grew to respect that. They waved politely, gave him space, and moved along. After a while, they stopped wondering why he came. Everyone grieves differently. But on one Tuesday morning in July, something changed. Thomas had just finished placing the flowers and was brushing off his knees when he felt it, that subtle sensation you get when someone's watching you. He looked over his shoulder, expecting to see a groundskeeper or a wandering pet. Instead, about 15 feet away, stood a boy. Maybe 6, maybe 7. Messy hair, red t-shirt. No adult in sight. Thomas tilted his head slightly. The boy didn't move, just stared at him, hands in his pockets, almost like he was waiting for something. "Morning," Thomas said kindly. The boy didn't answer. He looked at the headstone, then at Thomas, then back again. His expression wasn't sad, but it wasn't playful either. It was curious. Thomas turned back to the grave, confused but not alarmed. Maybe the boy was visiting someone too. Still, there was no one else around. After a few minutes, he glanced back again. The boy was gone. He didn't think much of it. Kids wandered through sometimes. Maybe the boy was with someone and had strayed. Still, something about the look in that child's eyes stayed with Thomas the rest of the day. It wasn't fear. It wasn't confusion. It was something else. The next morning, same time, same place. Thomas walked his usual route, flowers in hand. The air smelled of wet grass and pine. He knelt to lay the daisies down, adjusted them just the way Margaret would have liked, and was about to sit down when he heard footsteps. Turning around slowly, he saw the boy again. Same red shirt, same quiet eyes. This time, the boy was closer, maybe 10 feet away. "You all right, son?" Thomas asked. No response. The boy didn't look lost. He just stood there, watching again. There was something unsettling about how still he was, like a statue that had decided to come alive. Thomas gave him a soft smile and nodded toward another row of graves. "Are you here visiting someone?" Still nothing. The boy looked down at the flowers, then back at Thomas, then slowly turned and walked away down the gravel path. This time, Thomas stood up and followed a few steps, but the boy had already disappeared behind a line of trees near the edge of the cemetery. That evening, Thomas sat in his kitchen with a cup of tea, staring at the empty chair across from him. He thought about the boy. Where were his parents? Why was he wandering around alone? More importantly, why was he watching? He took a deep breath and said softly, "Did you see him, Margie? That little one?" The room, of course, didn't answer, but something in his gut told him this wasn't over, not even close. Thomas didn't sleep well that night. He kept thinking about the boy, the way he stood so still, so quiet, almost like he was listening to something that wasn't there, and the way he looked at Margaret's headstone, not with confusion, but with familiarity. That part stuck the most. It was like the boy knew what Thomas was doing and somehow understood it. The next morning, Thomas woke up a little earlier than usual. He moved slower these days, but his routine never changed. He dressed neatly, fixed his tie, and packed fresh daisies into the paper wrap like he did every morning. He grabbed his coat, just in case it rained, and headed out. As he drove the familiar route to Rosewood Cemetery, his eyes scanned the sidewalks more than usual. Maybe the boy lived nearby. Maybe he'd see him walking. But the streets were quiet. When he pulled into the cemetery, he parked in his usual spot under the old elm tree. The gravel crunched beneath his shoes as he made his way to Margaret's plot. It was calm that morning. A soft breeze moved the leaves, and the sun was still rising, casting a golden light across the grass. Thomas knelt down and placed the daisies in the vase. He brushed away a few fallen petals from the stone, then sat down on the bench like always. "Morning, Margie," he said, his voice low. "I think I've got a new neighbor here. A quiet one. Strange little fellow. You'd like him, though." He waited, letting the silence settle around him. The cemetery was peaceful, like always, but he couldn't shake the feeling that someone was near. And then he saw him. The boy was standing farther away this time, about 20 yards down the path, still wearing the same red shirt, still with his hands in his pockets, watching. Thomas raised a hand, giving a gentle wave. "You again?" he said softly. The boy didn't respond. He just tilted his head slightly, like he was studying Thomas. There was no fear in his eyes, just curiosity. Thomas stood up slowly and walked a few steps toward him. "You here for someone?" he asked again, his voice even. "You keep stopping by. I figure you must be visiting somebody." This time the boy spoke. "I like the way you talk to her." The words caught Thomas off guard. He stopped in his tracks. "Say that again?" The boy shifted on his feet. "I like how you talk to her," he repeated. "Like she's still here." Thomas's throat tightened. He glanced back at the grave, then at the boy. "She is still here," he said quietly. The boy nodded, almost like he understood. He looked down for a second, then turned and walked away again, back down the path, disappearing behind the trees like before. Thomas stood there a moment, heart beating a little faster than usual. He wasn't sure what had just happened, but it had stirred something inside him. He wasn't used to anyone, let alone a child, noticing what he did out there. People usually kept their distance. They didn't ask questions. They didn't comment. They certainly didn't say things like that. Back on the bench, Thomas sat down slowly. He let out a long breath and looked at Margaret's stone. "He said he liked how I talked to you," Thomas said. "Imagine that. A child saying something like that." The rest of the morning passed quietly. Thomas didn't see the boy again, but that sentence kept repeating in his mind over and over. "I like the way you talk to her." It wasn't just what the boy said. It was how he said it. Like he'd been watching Thomas for a while. Like he understood what it meant to talk to someone who wasn't there anymore, and still believe they were listening. Thomas stayed longer than usual that day, not because he had more to say, but because he was waiting for the boy to come back. But he didn't. Not that morning. Still, Thomas had the feeling he'd be seeing him again. The boy returned on Thursday. Thomas had started checking the path even before he reached Margaret's plot now. He tried not to admit it to himself, but part of him was hoping, waiting, for the boy to show up again. There was something about him that tugged at Thomas's mind like a loose thread. He didn't understand it, but he couldn't ignore it either. That morning was gray and cool. The clouds were thick, and the smell of rain clung to the air, but it hadn't started yet. Thomas moved slower than usual. His knees were stiff, and the ache in his hip made him wince a little with each step, but he didn't miss a day. He never would. He reached Margaret's grave and knelt with a small grunt, placing the daisies gently into the vase. He adjusted the ribbon around them. She always liked things neat, and ran a hand over the top of the stone, brushing away the dew. "Morning, sweetheart," he said. "Storm's coming, I think. Not bad, though. Just one of those gentle ones." He sat on the bench and sighed, rubbing his knee. The cemetery was quiet. No landscapers today, no visitors, just Thomas, Margaret, and the sound of leaves rustling in the breeze. Then, without a sound, the boy appeared again. This time he was closer, maybe 15 feet away, standing to the side, not directly on the path but near a patch of wildflowers. Same red shirt, same expression, calm, watching. Thomas turned his head slowly. "You again," he said, more to himself than anything. "I thought maybe you wouldn't come back." The boy took a small step forward. He didn't smile, but his face looked softer somehow, more open. "What's your name?" Thomas asked gently. The boy hesitated. He looked down at his feet, then back up. "Leo," he said finally. "Leo," Thomas repeated. "That's a good name. I'm Thomas." Leo nodded, almost politely. "You live nearby?" Leo shrugged. "Sort of." Thomas tilted his head. "Sort of?" Leo looked past him toward Margaret's headstone. "She was your wife?" "Yes, 49 years. Thomas smiled faintly. "Met her when I was 19. She spilled coffee on me on purpose at the bookstore. Claimed it was an accident, but she laughed before she said sorry, so I knew better." Leo didn't laugh, but his eyes didn't look sad either. Just interested. Present. "I come here every day," Thomas said. "Talk to her. She liked to talk, so I figured I'd keep the habit going. Helps me feel like she's not too far." Leo shifted a little closer. "You think she hears you?" Thomas looked at the gravestone for a long moment. "I like to think so. Makes the silence easier." They sat in that quiet for a while. The breeze picked up, and a few drops of rain began to fall, soft and slow. Thomas didn't move. Leo didn't either. Finally, Leo said, "Most people don't come here more than once, or if they do, they cry a lot." Thomas nodded. "Yeah, I did too. First year was rough. Couldn't even say her name out loud at first." Leo's eyes stayed on the gravestone. "She was lucky." Thomas blinked, caught off guard. "Why do you say that?" "To have someone come back. Every day." The words hit Thomas right in the chest. He swallowed hard, the emotion creeping up before he could stop it. "Yeah," he said. "Well, I was the lucky one, truth be told." Leo nodded slowly, then looked away. "I have to go." Thomas stood up. "Wait, do you come here for someone too? Is there someone you visit?" Leo paused. His shoulders shifted a little, but he didn't turn around. "Sort of," he said again. Then, without another word, he walked away down the path, disappearing around the trees like he had the other times. Thomas stood there for a long while, watching the empty path. Something about the way Leo spoke, the way he said "sort of," it didn't sit right. It wasn't just a kid wandering through, there was more to this. And Thomas was going to find out what. Thomas showed up earlier the next morning. Something about that last conversation had left him unsettled. He'd replayed Leo's words in his head all night, especially that last part. Sort of. It wasn't the kind of thing a kid said unless there was something he didn't want to explain. And Thomas couldn't let it go. By 8:30 a.m., he was already walking through the gates of Rosewood Cemetery. The air was heavy with the scent of rain-soaked earth from the night before. Drops of water still clung to the edges of leaves. His coat flapped behind him as he made his way to Margaret's plot, but this time he wasn't just looking ahead. He was scanning the area. No sign of Leo. He knelt, placed the daisies, and gave the gravestone a quick wipe, but his focus was elsewhere. His eyes kept drifting toward the trees, toward the row Leo always disappeared behind. He didn't sit on the bench like usual. Not today. Instead, after a short pause, he turned and started walking. He took the path Leo always followed, winding past rows of stones he'd never looked at before. Names and dates blurred past him. He glanced at each one, reading quickly, not knowing exactly what he was looking for, but sure he'd know it when he saw it. A few minutes later, he spotted a groundskeeper raking leaves near the far side of the cemetery. A younger man, maybe in his 30s, wearing headphones and moving with the kind of energy Thomas vaguely remembered having. Thomas approached slowly. "Morning," he called out. The groundskeeper pulled out one earbud and turned. "Oh, hey, good morning, sir. Can I ask you something?" "Sure thing." "Have you seen a boy around here lately?" Thomas asked. "About 6, maybe 7. Red shirt. Been here the last few mornings?" The groundskeeper scratched the back of his neck. "Can't say I have. Most folks who come here are older. Not a lot of kids. He's been showing up around 9, quiet. Watches me while I visit my wife." "Sorry," the man said. "Haven't seen anyone like that. You think he's lost?" Thomas shook his head. No, he didn't seem lost. More like he was here for someone. "Well, I can ask the others, see if anyone else has noticed a kid fitting that description." "I'd appreciate that," Thomas said. "Just curious, really. Something about him, I don't know." They exchanged nods, and Thomas turned back toward the path, but now his eyes were sharper, more focused. As he walked, he noticed something new. A small section near the east side of the cemetery. A plot of smaller gravestones. Children's graves. He slowed down. The area was quiet, tucked beneath a pair of weeping willows. The grass was shorter there, the stones newer. He glanced at the names as he walked by. Most had flowers. A few had toys, stuffed animals, balloons, deflated and tangled in the grass. Then he saw one. It was a simple stone. No decorations. Just a name and 2 dates. Leo Martin, 2015 to 2018. Thomas stared at it. His breath caught in his throat. He stepped closer, heart pounding louder now. The grave was clean, undisturbed. No flowers, no toys. Just silence. Leo. He backed away slowly, trying to piece it together. The boy had said his name was Leo. He looked about 6 or 7, but this Leo had died at 3 years old. That wasn't possible. It couldn't be. But in his gut, Thomas knew. He felt it. The way the boy had watched him. The way he'd listened. the way he spoke about talking to someone who couldn't answer. She was lucky. He hadn't said it like a child who was guessing. He said it like someone who knew what it meant to be forgotten. Thomas stood still, his eyes fixed on the stone. No one visits this one, he thought. No fresh flowers, no voice speaking to the air, no bench nearby. He took a deep breath and turned back toward Margaret's grave, walking slower now. The cemetery looked different somehow. He didn't see Leo that day, but somehow, it felt like Leo had seen him. The next morning, Thomas brought 2 sets of flowers. One was the usual daisies for Margaret. The other was a small bundle of bluebells, tied with a thin white ribbon. He didn't know why he chose bluebells. He just did. They seemed right, quiet, gentle, like something you'd give to someone who never had the chance to grow up. When he got to Margaret's grave, he laid her flowers down first, arranged them the way she liked, smoothed out the grass, sat on the bench and gave her the usual update about the weather, about his sore knee, about the soup he'd ruined the night before by forgetting the salt. But his eyes kept drifting toward the edge of the cemetery. He wasn't sure what he was expecting. Maybe to see Leo standing there again. Maybe to find him sitting by his own grave, somehow understanding everything that Thomas had discovered. But no one came. After a while, Thomas stood, picked up the second bundle of flowers, and made the walk again. The same one he'd taken the day before, down the gravel path past the older sections, through the line of willows, and into the quiet corner with the smaller stones. Leo Martin. The name still echoed in his head like a riddle that wasn't meant to be solved. He knelt down in front of the grave and placed the bluebells gently on the grass. "Morning, Leo," he said softly. "Figured you deserved some company, too." The wind stirred the leaves above him. No voice answered. No shadow moved. But Thomas didn't feel alone. "I looked for you this morning," he continued. "Thought maybe you'd be watching again. Guess I was wrong." He exhaled slowly and sat back on the grass. "You know," he said, looking at the headstone, "you're the first person I've talked to here besides my Margie. Most folks keep to themselves around this place. But not you. You just showed up." He smiled a little. "I thought maybe you were someone's kid, just visiting. But when you said your name, I don't know. Something in me already knew." He looked down at the grass, brushing it gently with his fingertips. "I'm sorry no one comes to see you. That's not right. Everybody deserves to be remembered." He sat in the silence for a while. It was a different kind of quiet than with Margaret. Softer, sadder, like the air itself had stopped to listen. Then he heard footsteps behind him. He turned. Leo was standing there. Same red shirt, same quiet face. Only this time, he looked different. Not older, not younger. Just clearer, somehow. Like a shadow that had stepped into the light. "You found me," Leo said. Thomas nodded slowly. "I did." Leo stepped closer and looked at the flowers. "They're nice." "I didn't know what you liked," Thomas said. "Took a guess." Leo knelt beside the grave, staring at it quietly. "No one ever brings anything," he said. "I think they forgot me." Thomas swallowed the lump in his throat. "That happens less than it should, but more than it ought to." Leo looked up at him. "Why do you still come every day? To talk to her?" Thomas glanced back in the direction of Margaret's grave. "Because when you love someone long enough, you don't stop talking just because they're quiet." Leo tilted his head. "Does it make you feel better?" "It makes me feel closer," Thomas said. "And on some days, that's enough." They sat in silence for a few minutes. Leo didn't speak. He just looked at the flowers like they were something rare and delicate. Then he stood up slowly. "Will you come back?" Thomas looked at him. "To visit you?" Leo nodded. "Of course," Thomas said. "As long as I can walk, I'll be here." Leo gave the faintest smile. It wasn't big, just enough. Then he turned and walked away again, disappearing between the stones. Thomas didn't follow. He stayed right where he was, beside the grave, hands folded in his lap, eyes fixed on the flowers. He would come back. For Margaret, for Leo, because no one should ever be left talking to the wind alone. Thomas started bringing 2 sets of flowers every day now. It wasn't even something he decided. More like a shift that happened naturally, the same way his hand always reached for the kettle at 7 a.m., or how he still parked under the same elm tree. Routine had kept him steady after Margaret passed. Now, without thinking about it too much, Leo had become part of that routine. He still brought daisies for Margaret. But for Leo, he picked something different each time. Marigolds, poppies, white lilacs. He didn't know what Leo liked. Wasn't sure Leo even could like anything anymore, but it felt wrong not to bring something. Some days he brought small toys too. A rubber frog, a plastic race car, a keychain flashlight. Things a boy might have liked if he'd had more time. It had been a week since Leo had first spoken to him, and since then, he'd been appearing regularly, never too close, never too long. Just enough to say something short. Just enough to be real. He always showed up around the same time, just as Thomas was finishing his visit with Margaret. He'd appear near the trees, hands in his pockets, like he was waiting for permission to approach. And then they'd walk together to his grave. Their conversations were short, but they stuck in Thomas's mind long after he left. "Do you think people dream when they're gone?" Leo had asked once. "I don't know," Thomas had answered. "I hope so. That would be a nice way to spend the time." Another day. "Do you think your wife misses you?" "I'd like to think so, but I think she'd be proud, too, of me still showing up." Leo had nodded at that. Most people stop showing up. Thomas never asked how Leo knew so much. He didn't want to push. He didn't want to scare him off. And truthfully, there was something in Leo's voice, too calm, too certain, that made Thomas not want to know more than Leo wanted to give. But he had started to notice something else. Leo never talked about himself. Not once did he mention parents. No stories about a favorite toy, a pet, a bedtime story, a last memory. Nothing about how he died. Nothing about what happened after. It was like the boy existed in this narrow space between moments. Never before. Never after. Just now. And every time Thomas left the cemetery, he couldn't help but look back over his shoulder. Leo never followed, never waved. He just faded into the distance, and Thomas would feel that ache in his chest again, the one that made him feel older than he was. He began asking around more, quietly. He asked the woman who ran the front office at Rosewood if there had ever been a Leo Martin buried there. She pulled out the old logbook without hesitation. "Yep," she said, pointing to the entry. 3-year-old, car accident. Parents moved away a while ago. I don't think they ever came back." Thomas swallowed. "No visitors at all?" She shook her head. "Not that I've seen. Poor kid." He walked out of the office slower that day. That night, he sat in his armchair, a cup of tea cooling in his hand, and stared at a framed photo of Margaret on the shelf. She was smiling, holding a basket of apples. He didn't even remember taking that picture, but it made his heart ache in the best way. "Did you know this would happen?" he asked her photo. "That someone else would need me? That I'd still have something to give? The room, as always, said nothing. But when Thomas closed his eyes that night, he dreamed of bluebells and quiet laughter. And in the morning, he bought sunflowers, big, bright, and bold. He figured Leo could use a day with something cheerful. The boy was waiting for him, just like before. Same red shirt, same quiet presence. But this time, when Thomas sat down next to the small grave, Leo spoke first. "You don't have to keep coming." Thomas looked at him surprised. "I want to," he said. "That's the difference." Leo didn't respond right away. He just looked down at the grass, where the sunflowers lay like a promise. And then he said something Thomas wasn't ready for. "What happens when you're gone?" Thomas didn't know the answer. Not yet. The next morning, Thomas didn't speak right away. He sat on the bench near Margaret's grave, the same way he always did, holding 2 bundles of flowers in his lap. Daisies for her, and small wild violets for Leo. The air felt heavier than usual, like the clouds were listening in. And Thomas, for once, didn't feel like talking to the gravestone in front of him. He was thinking about Leo's question. What happens when you're gone? It had stayed with him all night. He couldn't stop replaying it. The way the boy said it. Not with fear, not even with sadness. Just wondering. Like he was preparing himself. Like he already knew the answer and just wanted to hear it said out loud. After a while, Thomas stood and gently placed the daisies at Margaret's grave. He didn't speak this time. He just touched the stone with 2 fingers, then turned and began the quiet walk toward Leo's corner of the cemetery. He didn't expect to see the boy already there. Leo stood in front of his own grave, staring at it like it didn't belong to him, like it was a mistake someone had carved into stone. "You beat me here," Thomas said softly. Leo didn't look up. "I was already here." Thomas stopped beside him and crouched to place the violets at the base of the stone. "Violets today," he said. "My Margie used to call them shy flowers. Said they looked like they were always waiting for someone else to speak first." Leo knelt down slowly, brushing his fingers through the grass. "Thank you," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Thomas sat on the ground, legs crossed, hands on his knees. "Leo," he said after a moment, "why did you ask me that yesterday? About when I'm gone?" Leo didn't answer right away. He picked at a blade of grass, twisted it between his fingers, then finally looked up. "Because that's how it goes," he said. "First they stop visiting, then they stop remembering, and then there's nothing. Just quiet. Forever." Thomas felt the words press into his chest. "You remember your parents?" he asked carefully. Leo shrugged. "Sort of. I remember a blue blanket, a song, the smell of oranges, but not faces, not voices." "I'm sorry." Leo shook his head. "It's just how it is." Thomas let the silence sit between them for a while. He watched the wind move through the grass. A bird landed on a nearby branch and chirped twice before flying off. "You asked what happens when I'm gone," Thomas finally said. "The truth is, I don't know. Maybe someone else keeps coming. Maybe not. But you won't be forgotten." Leo looked at him. "How do you know?" Thomas gave a tired smile. "Because I remember you now. And as long as I'm breathing, you'll have that. And after me, maybe someone else will. But it starts with one person. That's how remembering works. You pass it on." Leo was quiet for a long time. Then he stood up and reached into his pocket. "I brought something," he said. Thomas raised his eyebrows. "You did?" Leo nodded and held out a small object. It was a toy car. Old, the paint chipped. One of the ones Thomas had left on the grave days earlier. "You should keep it," Leo said, "so you remember." Thomas took the toy gently, turning it over in his hand. It was lighter than he expected. "Thank you," he said. Leo looked down again, voice barely audible. "No one ever brought me anything before you." Thomas reached out and placed a hand on the boy's shoulder. "Well," he said softly, "you deserved it." They stood there a while longer. Neither one spoke. The clouds shifted above them, and light broke through, casting long shadows across the grass. Then Leo looked up at Thomas with something different in his expression. Not sorrow, not confusion, peace. "I think I can rest now," he said quietly. Thomas's breath caught. Leo turned, walked a few steps, and looked back one last time. "Goodbye, Mr. Thomas." And then he was gone. Not behind a tree, not into the fog. Just gone. Thomas stood still, holding the toy car in his hand. He looked at the small grave, then up at the sky and whispered, "Goodbye, Leo." He knew he'd be back tomorrow, but for the first time, he wouldn't be waiting for anyone. Thomas kept coming. Every morning at 9 sharp, just like before. Daisies in one hand, something small for Leo in the other, even if Leo didn't show up anymore. It had been 4 days since the boy's last words. "I think I can rest now." And, "Goodbye, Mr. Thomas." He hadn't seen him since. No red shirt behind the trees, no quiet footsteps on the gravel, just silence. But a different kind than before. Not empty, not aching, just still. On this particular morning, Thomas moved slower. His hip had been bothering him more than usual, and the damp weather wasn't helping. But he didn't complain. He never did. He just got out of the truck, locked the door, and made the walk like he always did. When he reached Margaret's grave, he knelt carefully and placed the daisies in the vase. "Morning, sweetheart," he said softly. "Clouds are thick today. You would have told me to bring an umbrella. I didn't." He chuckled quietly. "I think I saw your old red sweater in the closet yesterday. Smells like that soap you used. I sat with it for a while. Hope that's not weird." He talked a little longer, about the neighbor's barking dog, about the letter from the electric company, about how dry the toast was yesterday. The usual stuff. The kind of things you say when you love someone long enough that even silence deserves an update. Then he stood and looked toward the edge of the cemetery. He didn't expect to see Leo. Not anymore. But the habit was still there. His eyes always drifted toward that quiet row beneath the willows. And every time the same feeling returned. Not grief, not sadness, but presence. He walked slowly to Leo's grave, holding a small red toy fire truck in his hand. That morning, when he passed the drugstore, he saw it in the window. Something about it reminded him of the boy. Brave, quiet, waiting. He knelt down and placed the fire truck carefully beside the headstone. "Morning, Leo," he said gently. "Got you something. Thought it might fit." The wild violets from the other day were still there. Faded, but not wilted. He was learning which flowers lasted longer. Which ones looked the way a boy's grave shouldn't have to look. He didn't know why it mattered. It just did. He sat down on the grass and rested his hand on his knee. "I haven't seen you," he said. "Not since the goodbye." A bird chirped somewhere overhead. "I hope that means what I think it means. That you're okay, wherever you are." He paused. "I've been thinking about your question, about what happens when I'm gone." He glanced up at the sky. "I don't have a perfect answer. Still working on that. But I made a choice. Talked to the office here. I asked them to make a note in my file. When my time comes, I want to be buried close to you. Not right next to you. Margaret would give me a look. But nearby. So you don't feel forgotten again. His voice cracked at the end. Just slightly. He cleared his throat. I hope that's all right. The breeze picked up a little, rustling the leaves in the trees above. The sound was soft, almost like someone whispering through the branches. Thomas smiled. I take that as a yes. He sat there for a long while, watching the wind, watching the sky. His knees ached, but he didn't care. He had time. Before he left, he brushed the grass flat around the toy truck and stood up slowly. As he turned to go, he gave the stone one last look, and something caught his eye. At the base of the grave, just beneath the carved letters, was a small line of writing he swore hadn't been there before. Thank you. That was all. No voice, no boy, no flash of red shirt. Just those two words, etched faintly in the stone, like the morning dew had arranged them just for him. Thomas didn't say a word. He just smiled and walked back to Margaret one last time that morning. It had been a year since Thomas first saw the boy in the red shirt. 12 months of morning walks, 2 sets of flowers, and quiet conversations, some out loud, some in the silence of memory. Rosewood Cemetery hadn't changed much. The trees still swayed the same way in the breeze. The gravel paths still crunched underfoot. But for Thomas, everything felt different now. He still came every morning, still wore his pressed shirt, still brought daisies for Margaret. But the second stop, Leo's, was now just as much a part of his routine as breathing. Even though the boy hadn't appeared since that final morning, Thomas never stopped visiting. And he never stopped remembering. On this particular day, the sky was soft and overcast. A breeze moved slowly through the trees, brushing the leaves with gentle hands. Thomas stepped carefully over a small puddle near the front gate, nodding at the groundskeeper on his way in. He moved slower these days. His balance wasn't what it used to be, and he carried a cane now, though he hated the way it made him feel old. He reached Margaret's grave and knelt carefully, groaning under the weight of his years. He arranged the daisies and sat on the bench beside her stone. "Morning, love," he said, voice tired but steady. "The violets are coming in nicely this year, and the hydrangeas are blooming behind the house. You'd love the colors." He paused, smiling faintly. "Still can't figure out how to make soup the way you did. I tried again last night. It was awful. I blame the carrots." He chuckled softly and wiped a speck of dirt from her name. "I've been thinking about how this all started. How I used to just talk to you here, and then, well, that boy showed up. Changed everything." He looked toward the willows in the distance. Still no red shirt. No shadow standing between the stones. But he didn't expect one. Not anymore. He stood slowly and began the walk to Leo's grave, the way he always did. It was different now. Brighter. The small patch had been cleaned up over the last year. Thomas had planted a ring of flowers, bluebells, violets, sunflowers. He'd added a tiny wind chime to the tree nearby. The soft tinkling sound now greeted him every morning, like a voice he could almost recognize. At the grave, he knelt and placed a small plastic toy on the grass. A tiny astronaut this time. Margaret always said kids should dream big. "Morning, Leo," he said quietly. "You'd be about 9 now. Hard to picture." He rested his hand gently on the cool stone. "I don't know what comes next. But I hope, wherever you are, you're not alone. That there's someone to bring you flowers." Someone to talk to you, the way I talked to Margaret, the way I talked to you. The wind moved through the branches, and the chime rang softly. Thomas smiled. You gave me something I didn't know I needed, he said. Purpose. Connection. I thought I came here to hold on to her, but you reminded me. I still had something to give. He stayed a while longer, sitting in the grass. No words this time, just the sound of birds and wind and time. Eventually he stood, brushing off his knees, and turned back toward the path. But before he left, he looked down one more time. The toy car Leo had once given him was tucked into his coat pocket. He carried it every day now, not for show, for memory. He touched the stone gently. Goodbye, Leo. And then he walked away. He didn't look back, because he knew. Somewhere, someone would remember the boy in the red shirt, just like Thomas did. And in that remembering, Leo would never truly be gone. Thank you for watching. If you enjoy meaningful stories like this, we'd love to have you as a subscriber.